Bringing a board into business governance is a rational and strategic decision.
There are many companies on the market that, in reality, have what you might call a toy board, one that simply agrees with whatever the owner says.
When you serve on a supervisory board, you focus more on managing risks and driving long-term impact. There are studies that confirm that teams with a balanced board of men and women achieve better financial results.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Boards of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel. Today we're joined by our guest, Natalie Palina. Natalia, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
With Natalia, we'll discuss topics related to boards of directors and supervisory boards, and, by the way, career development within boards, their importance in the current Ukrainian context, and the role of women in corporate governance. Natalia has extensive management experience across FMCG, fintech, education, and healthcare. She's also a guest lecturer at the Ukrainian Catholic University. In addition, Natalia serves on the supervisory board of Dobrobut and as an advisory board member for a Swiss company. Natalia has also made a market entry for the American University in Ukraine.
Yes, that's right. And now, starting this year, I began teaching at a new private university in Switzerland.
Natalia, you have extensive management experience as well as board experience, both in Ukraine and internationally. In your opinion, how important are boards of directors in any form, whether supervisory boards or advisory boards, for Ukrainian businesses right now during the full-scale war?
I'll mostly focus on private business because the public sector already has much more experience working with boards. However, the requirements there are different, as is the overall approach to implementing corporate governance. In private business specifically, if a company has a long-term strategy or needs to build one, if it's planning geographical expansion, a merger or acquisition, the integration of a new business, or even a divestment, or if it's a startup, in all these cases, I'd say it makes sense to consider whether forming a board could be the right tool to help address the challenges that come with projects of that scale. Because for Ukrainian private businesses, introducing a board is still a relatively new approach. In most cases, businesses were led by the owners themselves. They've been deeply involved in operations. They know every employee by name, and they understand exactly how everything works. But sooner or later, every business reaches a point where it needs to move to the next stage of development. And when that happens, bringing in people with diverse experience who are ready to engage, quickly understand your business, and offer meaningful support in addressing key challenges can be extremely valuable. Whether it's a supervisory board, an advisory board, or another form of expert involvement, I believe such a structure can significantly benefit the business overall.
At the beginning of the full-scale invasion, many business owners actually dissolved their boards and took back full control of their companies. However, over time, and we can see this clearly now, many of them are returning to the idea of proper corporate governance and rebuilding their boards of directors, supervisory boards, or advisory boards. This shift largely comes from the realization that many owners lack certain experience and expertise, especially when it comes to navigating the kind of complex challenges businesses are facing today. These challenges include not only external factors related to the war and the risks it brings, but also the rise of artificial intelligence, rapid technological development, and the disruptions that come with them.
So yes, continuing your thought, I would say that having a board or involving a board in business governance is a rational, well-grounded decision rather than an emotional one. Accordingly, it requires a pragmatic approach. And of course, the challenges that Ukrainian businesses are currently facing, along with those brought by artificial intelligence and various transformations, the talent shortage and so on, make me think that against the backdrop of all these challenges, engaging a board might actually be the simplest solution for approaching such complex issues.
What's your view? You mentioned state-owned companies earlier. Obviously, that's a completely different governance model with its own specifics and structure. But if we look at the broader market, we can still see many companies with what I'd call decorative boards. Boards that simply agree with the owner's every decision. They exist as an attribute of a large company, but in practice, they don't add any real value because they don't bring in independent perspectives or true expertise. They just echo the owner. In your opinion, what are the key criteria that determine whether a board actually creates added value for a business or doesn't?
The first and most important factor is the board's composition. For me, that's even more critical than the decision to implement corporate governance itself. Once you've defined your business needs and strategic goals, the next step is identifying who should be on that board. To create genuine added value, you need to look at your company's long-term goals, ambitions, and strategic challenges, the ones that truly shape its future. If there's no long-term strategy, if the aim is simply to maintain the current status quo, then it probably doesn't make sense to move toward a corporate governance model. In that case, it would likely result in a sort of hybrid, formalized setup. But if there are real plans for business growth, expansion, increased profitability, entering new markets, updating the portfolio, or perhaps acquiring and integrating another business. In all these cases, the goal is to move faster, make fewer mistakes, because we bring in people who have actually done it before. Each of us has gone through these processes many times, so we can anticipate what might happen, immediately highlight the key risks, and help the executive team navigate the path much more easily, efficiently, and effectively. In public business, the primary function of a board is oversight and control. In private companies, I don't really see control as the board's main role. There's not much to control, because by its very nature, a private business is self-regulating. It's driven by the profitability goals of specific individuals.
Especially when the owner is also the CEO.
The owner is the CEO and so on. When that's the case, the rules of the game are already quite clear. So the board's role, whether advisory, supervisory, or any other form, is primarily about protecting the business. It's about ensuring the company's sustainable growth and helping it follow the most optimal path toward its goals. Personally, I'm fortunate not to have had any experience with artificial or decorative boards, and I'd really prefer to avoid ever being in that kind of situation, because I can imagine how frustrating it must be when someone genuinely wants to contribute, to invest their time, their expertise, their professional value, and yet finds themselves in a setting where none of that actually makes a difference. That must be a painful experience. In my case, I'm glad to say that the boards I'm part of are quite the opposite. I genuinely feel that my experience is not only valued, but also makes a real difference. It brings tangible value to the company and to the business as a whole.
Some potential future board members ask about motivation. In reality, if you think about it, compensation is rarely the main motivation for joining an advisory or supervisory board. Seeing the results of your work, that's the real motivation. Understanding that your experience matters, that your contribution helped the company take a meaningful step forward.
You know, I realized that when you work in an executive role, especially early in your career as a mid-level manager, you're focused on achievements. The wins are tangible and you're part of the team that delivers them. But when you move up to the director level, the success of the business still relates to you, of course. But most of your day-to-day is about dealing with problems. Because when your team can handle something on its own, it does and brings you the results. But if there is a problem, what actually fills your day to a large extent is problem solving and resource management for the business. On a supervisory board, however, you work much more with risks and long-term impact. Your focus shifts to the company's future, how it will respond to challenges, what resources it will need, and how resilient it can become. And you no longer think, this was my achievement. Instead, it becomes, because we worked on this together. They achieved it. They made it happen. They're growing. And that gives you a completely different kind of satisfaction compared to when you're a direct contributor.
Exactly. And that's also why it's very difficult to define clear KPIs for a board or for an individual board member tied to a company's financial performance. Because it's impossible to separate the board's influence or one member's influence from the executive team's collective success.
It's always a shared success. In fact, the effectiveness of a board is often reflected in what didn't happen.
There were no crises.
No problems occurred, no money was lost, and that, as a rule, is impossible to measure. Ultimately, a board's effectiveness or a member's success is better reflected in the longevity of the relationship and the company's sustainable performance over time.
And a true achievement for a board is when the executive team embraces a board's recommendation as its own decision and implements it wholeheartedly. Exactly. The executive team might even believe it was entirely their own idea, but if it leads to success, the board has done its job.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
Natalia, you started working in corporate governance after your executive career. What first drew your attention to this field, to boards of directors, supervisory boards, and advisory boards?
I actually joined my first board while I was still working in an executive role. But for me, thinking about my personal long-term strategy has always been important. I constantly ask myself, what will I be doing for the next 20 years? How do I want to develop myself? What truly interests me? The natural next step in a marketing or commercial director's career is usually becoming a CEO. But when I looked at my own background, I realized that most of my experience had been with Western companies. These are international corporations, large organizations that operate very differently from local businesses. So, after assessing my options to stay and work in Ukraine, I realized that the CEO role didn't really appeal to me. Around that time, I started hearing from people in my network that boards were becoming more active, that this whole topic was growing and becoming increasingly relevant, not only in the public sector, but also in private business. So I began talking to people, asking questions. What does your work on a board actually involve? What's your role? Who do you serve with? How does it all work in practice? I also met with friends and colleagues who work in executive search and recruitment. I asked for their perspective. I still remember one particular conversation with a very well-known recruiter in Ukraine, one of the best in the field. I said, listen, I want to ask you something. You've known me for years. You've followed my career. You know my strengths. I'm thinking about starting this journey in corporate governance, joining boards. What do you think? What's your honest reaction to that? He said, you know, you're absolutely ready, professionally and managerially, but you're still a bit too young. Wait a little. And I thought, no, I'm not ready to wait another 5 or 10 years. I want to try this now. And if I'm professionally ready, then why not? And so talking to people, I said that I would be interested in this. At the same time, the company realized that it needed competencies specifically in marketing, innovation, and strategy. And they were exploring several different ways to address that need to be decided. And when demand met proposition, we both said, let's give it a try. It turned out to be a very successful decision, both for the company and for me, because the organization is incredibly interesting and complex and modern.
You mean Dobrobot?
Yes, I'm referring to Dobrobot.
And in what year did you join the board?
That was in 2024.
Was it the first convocation of the board?
No, the board already existed. It was an active, functioning board that I joined because the business needed exactly that type of experience and expertise to support its long-term strategy. And perhaps I can expand on that a bit. When you join an already established board, one that's been working together effectively for several years and understands the business deeply, the main challenge you face is telling yourself you have to get up to speed quickly, understand the business thoroughly, and learn how everything operates to be effective. You're not used to being ineffective.
Natalie, what was most important for you when transitioning from an executive to a non-executive role?
The hardest part of moving from an executive to a non-executive position is that your relationship with the business changes completely. Everyone talks about this. Those who already have experience as non-executive directors often say, nose in, hands out. Fortunately, I learned that before I joined the board. And I consciously kept myself in check so as not to start substituting for or initiating any activities that should be carried out by the executive team. I believe that as a non-executive director, it's crucial to remember what it feels like to be an executive director reporting to a non-executive board. If we keep that in mind, it becomes much easier for us to be truly effective in relation to the executive team, to give them space, recognition, and the respect they deserve, because they are the ones running the business every day. They are the ones delivering the results. Our job is to back them up and help them solve the challenges that are too big, too complex, or too far ahead in time for them to handle alone.
What was the most important factor for you in deciding to join your first board?
For me, the most important thing was the current composition of the board. The people, their experience, personalities, and the way they interact, that was the key factor in my decision. And I think that's something I would really emphasize for the viewers of this channel, something worth paying attention to. Because when you transition into a non-executive role, you lose your direct reports. You don't have a team anymore. You only have the people with whom, and it's quite a small circle, 5 or 6 people perhaps, you actually discuss the business. So they need to be interesting to you professionally and engaging to you as individuals. You need to feel comfortable working with them. That's the most essential thing. The second question you ask yourself is, what will get better in this business because of my presence here? That's where all your professional qualities, your experience, and your accumulated capital come into play. This helps you quickly figure things out and provide assistance.
You have experience working both on the board of a Ukrainian company and on the board of a foreign company. Would you say there are any notable differences between the two, or are all boards essentially the same?
That's a very good question, and one I was actually expecting you to ask. Something related to startups? You didn't ask about that directly, but I'll still share. Since the board I serve on in Switzerland is more connected to startup businesses, I remember being genuinely surprised when I first joined. I actually came across that opportunity on LinkedIn. I saw a post saying they were looking for professionals with a certain profile to join their advisory board. I responded, was invited to a meeting, and that's where I met the person leading the business. During that conversation, I realized that for him, The board, despite the company's very small turnover and the limited number of full-time employees, plays a much broader role. By engaging the board, he gains not only advice but also support, connections, and occasionally even asks us to get involved in negotiations with potential partners to help accelerate and strengthen the implementation of his strategy. In a Ukrainian company, there is probably less formality. In Switzerland, everything is very precisely structured. Indoor meetings are planned well in advance with a clear agenda and strict procedures. Everything is highly formalized. In Ukrainian business, there's more adaptability, and I think that's largely shaped by the times we're living through. Board meetings often happen on demand, with additional sessions arranged as needed to discuss specific, sometimes urgent issues. And I'd say those are probably the two biggest differences. I'd also like to return to the topic of startups, because in our country, IT in general, there are so many successful projects of Ukrainian origin, and some already implemented, others still on their way, that are operating on a truly global level. Within Ukraine, however, the founder or business owner often can't yet afford to bring in highly qualified, experienced professionals on a full-time basis. And if you think about people like me, well, what kind of offer would it have to be to go full-time? It would need to be a very interesting business with really engaging challenges.
Especially for a company that doesn't yet have stable revenue.
And it's a startup where even the business model isn't fully clear yet, nothing is really. That's why bringing in high-level professionals to serve on an advisory or supervisory board is both realistic and appealing, even for the non-executive directors themselves. They can genuinely contribute and create value for a future business. And for the business, this brings an enormous range of support and expertise. I truly believe that for an early-stage company, it's a great solution. If I were building a startup myself, the first question I'd ask would be, who do I want on my board?
And probably, whether we're talking about startups or small and medium-sized businesses, decisions are made quickly and implementation happens fast, which means that a corporate director or board member can actually see the impact of their work right away, not years down the line, but here and now. Natalia, it's often said that women on supervisory boards still face certain barriers that prevent them from fully realizing their potential in this area, things like glass ceilings or biased selection practices. Have you personally encountered such challenges or not?
Looking at how many women in Ukraine are working, pursuing higher education and holding positions of responsibility, at first glance it might seem that we don't really have a problem. But on the other hand, everyone talks about the glass ceiling. We don't actually see it, but it exists. It's there because research data, gender equality indices, and similar studies clearly show that the higher we climb the career ladder, the fewer women we find in senior roles. For instance, according to some statistics I've seen, only around 18% of top management positions are held by women. And when we go even higher, like to board level, like that figure drops below 10%. Yet women make up roughly 50% of the population. So why does this imbalance exist? I think part of it comes down to certain stereotypes that still persist, ones we need to recognize and actively work through. They exist, and we just have to acknowledge that. Once we're aware of them, it becomes much easier to address them. Another important point is how board members are selected for businesses. Very often, it happens through networking, through people we already know. And because of that, visibility becomes a real challenge for women. The social circles of major business owners are still predominantly male, men talking to other men. So when the question arises, who would I like to bring onto my board? Who do I know? The number of women on that list is already quite small, and the number they truly understand or have worked with is even smaller. And perhaps that is precisely why we often end up with so very few women reaching the very highest echelons and top levels of company management. So the question is, how do we address this? I think that overall business is open. We need tools that will simply open these doors and act as catalysts. This is what I mentioned, the visibility of women. We need to know the profile of these specialists, what they are ready for, and which positions they could potentially hold. Another point, and I know this topic can spark mixed reactions, is that soft quotas can actually work. I personally experienced this when I worked at Danone. When I joined as a director back in 2011, I had a clear requirement. My team had to be 50-50 gender balanced, especially among those I identified as high potential employees. And at first you might think, how can you make choices that way? No. If you consciously remember that this balance matters and that it genuinely leads to better business results, which has been proven, you naturally start paying more attention and selecting people who will work well together with the right mix of professional qualities while also aligning with the balance target you've set. So quotas shouldn't be the final goal, but if we consider them as a tool, they can be very effective. I've seen that firsthand, and I'm convinced it works.
Now, due to the full-scale war, the gender balance in society will objectively change. Sadly, many people will not return from the front line, and most of them are men. Consequently, there will be increased demand for women, including in top management and on boards. And it's important that women are ready for that.
And that business is ready for it as well. Actually, you didn't mention this earlier during my introduction, but I'm also a board member of Women Leaders for Ukraine. This year, we launched a national award called Equal Opportunities, designed to recognize companies that actively promote and implement gender equality policies, procedures, and strategies, and that have removed the glass ceiling within their organizations, enabling women to advance without barriers. This year, we'll be presenting the very first award, recognizing companies that have already achieved meaningful progress in different aspects of this broad and important agenda.
In your view, is there any particular area of expertise that tends to be more common among women board members? For example, finance, HR, or perhaps something else?
In answering your question, I would like to avoid reinforcing stereotypes that have already formed. Whether the best CFO is a woman or a man, I haven't really seen a difference. I've seen some really great CFOs, both men and women. The same goes for marketing, the same for supply chain. All functions, there's no influence. Another matter is that perhaps there are some personal aspects where a woman might sense things more quickly, or a man might see the bigger picture faster, and so on. But this definitely does not determine whether they will be more effective in the position or not. Above all, in any approach, even when using quotas, the foundation is always hard skills. Technical expertise, experience, knowledge, education, then come personal qualities. And only after that, perhaps some additional factors we might take into account. But the goal is balance. The goal is not the promotion of women, because it's that balance that actually makes teams more effective. There is research that confirms that teams managed either by executive teams or boards that have a balance between women and men achieve better financial results. And I remember that it's more than a 20% better performance. Doesn't this goal justify the means we want to use to achieve it? When we look at Western Europe, Ukraine is still somewhat behind. And that's largely because Western Europe recognized the importance of this issue much earlier. They began experimenting with different tools, and in some countries, quotas were introduced. Those quotas weren't formalities, nor did they restrict men in any way. Instead, they created opportunities for women, and in doing so, helped dispel many of the stereotypes that had existed in society.
Yes, perhaps Ukraine really does need such a trigger to start this process. Because indeed, if we look at the Circle of Professional Corporate Governance Association, for example, among the members of the Professional Corporate Governance Network, there is roughly a 50-50 balance between men and women. The same applies to UCGA graduates. There is also a certain balance. But if we look at the number of women on boards of directors, there's a clear gap compared to those statistics. Some current members of boards of directors are opposed to introducing quotas. They believe that quotas could lead to symbolic appointments. In other words, companies would be forced to meet the required proportions, and as a result, some board members might be selected not based on professional merit, but because of the quota itself.
I've heard such opinions and seen that this is quite an emotional reaction. I believe that in the private business sector, we already have a kind of vaccine against that, a rational and pragmatic mindset among business owners, and I'm confident that for them, it would not be just a formal step. A soft form of quota, maybe not 50-50, but in smaller proportions, that could be completely comfortable and achievable. Moreover, we're not saying that there is a lack of women in the country with strong experience and good education, and with the ambition to move forward. That's not the problem we're trying to solve. We're addressing the issue that women don't have enough visibility and there are stereotypes that block their entry. So if that barrier is addressed, I don't think there will be any issue. As for state-owned companies, I also don't believe this is a gender issue. Because again, the pool of women who are ready for such positions is already large enough. Fortunately, in Ukraine, we don't suffer from a shortage of highly qualified professionals, either among men or women.
Natalia, would you recommend that executives, both men and women, currently working in different businesses consider joining supervisory or advisory boards? To what extent would you encourage them to view a non-executive career as a potential next step in their professional path?
I would definitely recommend it. Take a look at your career path and evaluate how satisfied you are with the diversity of your experience and the level of results you've achieved. That's the first step. Have you gained enough experience in managing teams and leading large-scale processes? Are you satisfied with who you are professionally at this stage? These are important questions, because when you move from an executive to a non-executive role, you lose a lot, but you also gain a completely different type of experience. So you need to feel that you've had enough of the executive side to be ready for something new. Another point, if you want to take this step, to try it, it doesn't mean you have to give up your executive position immediately. For your first non-executive role on a board, you can still combine both.
It's difficult.
Very difficult, but it's possible to try it once. At least tell yourself, I can manage both for the first year. A year is actually a short enough period. But during that time, you'll be able to feel and understand whether it's comfortable for you or not. Another thing, don't join a board just for the sake of joining a board. That shouldn't be the goal either. The composition of the board you join matters tremendously, because that small group of people is who you'll be solving all the key issues with. So if you feel ready, want to try, and there's a board you truly like to join, go for it. Try. When it comes to finding your first board, it's your network and your reputation that will work for you. Because one way or another, before you get invited to a board, others will be asked about their experience working with you and about your professional reputation. So your reputation is your strongest asset. And work on your network. Build connections that might lead you to a board position. I really like the saying, people hire people. That never changes. And it will always be like this. And since joining a board means entering a rather narrow circle, as I've already said today, it's a selective environment. They will be very careful in choosing members. So expand your network, nurture your reputation. It will definitely help you. And I'm still against agreeing to just anything for the sake of it. At some point, I even decided to apply for a position on a state supervisory board, just out of curiosity to see how the hiring process actually works. I knew I didn't really meet the candidate criteria, but I was just interested in going through the process. It's a completely different path compared to joining a board in the private sector. So if someone is interested in the public sector, they need to stay in good contact with the agencies that win tenders to recruit candidates for these state appointments. And of course, you have to make sure that your profile matches what the state is currently looking for. And for private business, it's your reputation, because the demand for each business profile can be different. Some companies need people with experience in integration or implementing IT solutions into operations. Others may be looking for brand building and long-term strategy. Some need M&A. Some will value other specific capabilities. There's much more room for professionals with diverse experience.
Practically any top management expertise can be valuable and in demand at the board level. The key is to find the right board, and maybe not limit your search to commercial or state companies. Consider public organizations, charitable foundations, or NGOs as well.
In fact, I think starting your non-executive career in the non-profit sector can be a great path, because you gain experience, contribute to a meaningful cause, and at the same time strengthen your visibility as a non-executive director.
Okay, now let's say there's a top manager who wants to start building a non-executive career. What should they do? Of course, they can talk to headhunters, but is that enough?
You need to clearly define what you can offer to that segment. Essentially, you have to market yourself, understand what kind of experience might be valuable for the private sector at that level, and build relationships with people in the private business community, with CEOs, with other non-executive directors. Because frankly, when you serve on a board, you want to work with interesting people you trust, both professionally and personally.
You want to discuss business with them. So naturally, those already on boards are interested in bringing in people they know and respect.
That's why this kind of networking is so important. Focus on it, nurture it, and eventually it will bring results.
And finally, what advice would you give to potential future board members, those who haven't yet made a firm decision about pursuing a non-executive career?
To women specifically, I would say, don't be afraid. Glass ceilings are actually quite fragile. You're not alone on this journey. Many women have already paved the way, and women who are successful and effective in their roles. We have countless examples of women leading businesses, becoming non-executive and independent directors, and taking on senior leadership roles. Follow that path, focus on your strengths. I always tell my teams and colleagues, don't waste energy on fixing your weaknesses. Focus on what you're great at, on what sets you apart, and the doors will open.
Natalia, thank you very much for such an inspiring and insightful conversation.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure and very inspiring for me as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. See you next time on Boards of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel.